The Galactic Trade Station Nexus 7 prided itself on being the pinnacle of interspecies civilization. Suspended in the void between three-star systems, it gleamed like a chrome monument to bureaucratic excellence, complete with enough safety regulations to choke a Vorthan space whale. The station's designers had apparently decided that nothing said advanced civilization quite like 17 different species of sentient beings standing in 17 different queues, all waiting to have their dignity systematically processed by customs officials who treated personal belongings like potential weapons of mass destruction. Which, to be fair, wasn't entirely wrong when it came to humans. The Zephyrians ran security with a kind of obsessive attention to detail that would make a tax auditor weep with joy. They had catalogued, categorized, and color-coded every conceivable threat in their massive database, cross-referenced with psychological profiles and threat assessments that read like dissertations on the fundamental inadequacies of non-Zephyrian species. Humans, naturally, occupied their own special category marked in what could only be described as panic red. Class 12 Deathworld inhabitants. The label said it all, really. While most civilized species had evolved on planets where the biggest daily concern was whether the local fruit was ripe enough for consumption, humans had somehow managed to survive on a rock where everything from the weather to the wildlife seemed personally invested in their extinction. The galactic community found this simultaneously fascinating and horrifying, like watching someone juggle chainsaws while riding a unicycle over a pit of lava, except the chainsaws were also on fire and somehow sentient. Lieutenant Commander Raven Torres stepped off the transport shuttle with the kind of easy confidence that made security officers reach for their panic buttons. She stood average height by human standards, which meant she was still tall enough to make most other species crane their necks uncomfortably. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her diplomatic uniform was pressed to specifications that would satisfy even the most pedantic military inspector. She looked, for all intents and purposes, like a perfectly reasonable representative of Earth's trading interests. The Zephyrians immediately classified her as a walking apocalypse. Chief Inspector Vexhai watched her approach through the security checkpoint with the expression of someone who had just discovered a live grenade in their lunchbox. His elongated cranium gleamed under the station's artificial lighting, and his forearms moved in the nervous, twitching pattern that Zephyrians displayed when confronted with anything more dangerous than a particularly aggressive houseplant. Lieutenant Commander Torres, he announced in the kind of voice usually reserved for funeral directives, you will proceed through standard security screening. All weapons, implements, and devices must be surrendered for the duration of your stay. Torres nodded with the patient smile of someone who had been through this particular dance more times than she cared to count. She placed her diplomatic satchel on the scanning platform and began the ritualistic removal of everything the Galactic Security Codex classified as potentially lethal when wielded by a Deathworld species. Out came the ceremonial dress sword, a beautiful piece that hadn't seen actual combat in 3 centuries but apparently still qualified as a threat to galactic peace. Out came the multitool, each of its 17 functions capable of being used for nefarious purposes according to subsection 447b of the Dangerous Implements Registry. Out came the personal grooming kit, because apparently even nail clippers became weapons of terror when held by human hands. And then came the knife. It was a simple thing, really. 6 inches of folded steel with a handle carved from oak, the kind of utilitarian blade that human settlers had been carrying for millennia. Its edge was sharp enough to cut through diplomatic red tape, metaphorically speaking, and it bore the worn patina that came from years of honest use in opening packages, cutting rope, and performing the 1,000 small tasks that required a proper blade. Vexhai regarded it with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for viewing exotic diseases under a microscope. This, he declared, holding the knife with 2 hands as if it might spontaneously combust, is a Class 7 personal combat implement. Possession of such devices by Deathworld species is strictly prohibited in all civilized sectors. Torres bit back the observation that calling a simple folding knife a Class 7 personal combat implement was roughly equivalent to classifying a dinner fork as artillery. Instead, she maintained her diplomatic smile and nodded as if this made perfect sense. Of course, Inspector. I wouldn't want to violate any protocols. Vexhai placed the knife in a containment field with the kind of reverence usually reserved for handling radioactive materials. The field hummed ominously, as if the knife might at any moment break free and embark on a killing spree through the station's corridors. "You understand," the inspector continued, his voice taking on the patronizing tone of someone explaining basic physics to a particularly slow child, "that here on Nexus 7, we maintain civilized standards of conduct. We do not resort to primitive displays of violence to resolve our differences. We use reason, logic, and proper diplomatic channels." "How wonderfully enlightened," Torres replied, her smile never wavering even as she internally composed a detailed list of where Vexi could stick his enlightened standards. The inspection continued with the kind of thoroughness that would have impressed a forensic accountant. Every pocket was emptied, every seam scanned, every potential hiding place examined with instruments that probably cost more than most planets' annual defense budgets. When they were finally satisfied that she posed no immediate threat to galactic civilization, they allowed her to proceed to the diplomatic quarter. The irony, of course, was that they had just confiscated the least dangerous thing about her. The Crystalline Consortium had booked Conference Room Epsilon 7, a space designed to intimidate visiting delegates with its vast windows overlooking the nebula beyond and furniture that had clearly been selected by someone who believed comfort was a sign of moral weakness. The Consortium's representatives arranged themselves around the negotiating table like a collection of living gemstones, their translucent bodies refracting the ambient light in patterns that would have been beautiful if not for the cold intelligence gleaming in their multifaceted eyes. Prismdar, the Consortium's lead negotiator, stood nearly 7 feet tall when fully extended, his crystalline form a shifting display of blues and purples that seemed to flow like liquid light. He possessed the kind of natural arrogance that came from belonging to a species that had mastered interstellar commerce, while most others were still figuring out agriculture. The fact that he was negotiating with a representative from what his people considered a backwards Deathworld was clearly a source of considerable irritation. "Ah, the human arrives," he announced in tones that suggested he was commenting on the arrival of something unpleasant that someone had tracked in on their shoes. How refreshing to encounter such primitive directness in our negotiations. Torres took her seat with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to navigate diplomatic minefields without triggering international incidents. Well, without triggering too many international incidents. "Consortium leader Prismdar," she replied, "thank you for agreeing to meet. I trust we can reach a mutually beneficial arrangement regarding the rare earth mining rights in the Kepler sector." The negotiations began with a kind of stilted formality that made watching paint dry seem thrilling by comparison. The Consortium had prepared a list of demands that read less like a trade agreement and more like terms of surrender, including exclusive mining rights, tax exemptions that would have bankrupted most governments, and environmental protections, so lax they barely qualified as suggestions. "You must understand," Prismdar explained with the patience of someone addressing a particularly slow-learning algorithm, "that humans simply lack the sophisticated technology necessary for efficient resource extraction. Your crude methods would damage the delicate crystalline formations we require for our industrial processes." Torres nodded thoughtfully, as if she was seriously considering the proposal that would essentially hand over an entire star system for the equivalent of pocket change. "I see. And in return, you offer—" "Our guidance," Prismdar replied, as if this were the most generous offer in the history of galactic commerce. "Access to proper civilization. The opportunity to learn from species who have moved beyond the barbaric tendencies of your world." Around the table, other Consortium members chittered agreement in their harmonic frequencies, a sound like wind chimes caught in a hurricane. They clearly expected the human to be overwhelmed by this magnanimous offer from their obviously superior civilization. Torres maintained her professional demeanor, even as she calculated exactly how many ways she could express her opinion of their generous offer without starting a diplomatic incident. The number was surprisingly high, but most of them would require explaining human anatomy in ways that would probably violate several decency statutes. "I appreciate the offer," she said finally, "but I'm afraid Earth's position is somewhat different. We view the Kepler sector as sovereign human territory, and any mining operations would need to reflect fair market values for the extracted resources." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Prismdar's coloring shifted to deeper purples and reds, patterns that Torres had learned indicated extreme displeasure in crystalline psychology. "Fair market values," he repeated, as if she had just suggested they pay their taxes in interpretive dance. You misunderstand your position in this negotiation, human. Your species lacks the standing to make demands of established galactic powers. Established powers who apparently can't extract resources without human cooperation, Torres observed mildly. The comment hit the table like a diplomatic grenade. The Consortium members erupted in harmonic discord, their crystals flashing angry reds and oranges as they chitted their outrage at such impertinence. How dare this primitive Deathworlder suggest that their obviously superior technology might have limitations? Prismdar rose to his full height, his form now cycling through colors that would have been considered warning signals in any species with a functioning survival instinct. You forget yourself, human. Your kind may be useful as manual laborers, but you lack the genetic sophistication for true leadership. Perhaps it would be better if we negotiated with more reasonable representatives of your species. The room fell silent except for the harmonic humming of agitated crystals and the soft whisper of the life support systems. Torres remained seated, her hands folded calmly on the table, but something in her posture had changed. The easy diplomatic mask had shifted slightly, revealing something harder underneath. Genetic sophistication, she repeated, her voice still perfectly level. That's an interesting phrase. Indeed, Prismdar continued, apparently mistaking her calm for submission. The crystalline genome has been perfected through millions of years of evolution. We have transcended the crude biological limitations that plague lesser species. Your people, on the other hand, remain trapped by the violent impulses of your primitive origin world. Torres nodded slowly, as if she were carefully considering this assessment. So you believe that evolution on a peaceful world makes you superior to species that evolved under more challenging circumstances? Obviously, Prismdar replied, his harmonic voice carrying the certainty of someone who had never questioned his place in the universe. Survival of the fittest is an outdated concept. True civilization comes from harmony, not from the barbaric competition that shaped your development. How fascinating, Torres said, and there was something in her tone that should have triggered every survival instinct that millions of years of peaceful evolution had bred out of the crystalline species. Tell me, Consortium leader, how much do you actually know about human evolution? Prismdar leaned forward, apparently interpreting her question as a sign that she was finally ready to acknowledge her species' inferiority. Enough to understand that your people developed through constant warfare and environmental catastrophe. Hardly the foundation for sophisticated thought. You're absolutely right, Torres agreed, and her smile was no longer entirely diplomatic. We did evolve under challenging circumstances. Do you know what we call a planet where everything is trying to kill you? A Deathworld, Prismdar replied, clearly pleased with his knowledge of galactic classification systems. Home, Torres corrected, and something in the way she said it made the life support systems seem suddenly very loud in the silence that followed. The Consortium leader apparently decided that this was the perfect moment to demonstrate exactly why peaceful evolution sometimes left species unprepared for the complexities of interstellar relations. He reached across the table with one crystalline appendage and grabbed Torres by the wrist, his grip tight enough to cut off circulation. Perhaps, he said, his harmonic voice dropping to frequencies that would have been threatening if he had been dealing with any species other than humans, you need a more direct demonstration of the consequences of defying Consortium authority. Torres looked down at the crystalline hand wrapped around her wrist, then back up at Prismdar's multifaceted eyes. Her expression was one of mild curiosity, as if she were observing some interesting but ultimately harmless scientific phenomenon. Consortium leader, she said quietly, I'm going to give you exactly one opportunity to remove your hand. Prismdar's grip tightened instead, and around the table, other Consortium members began rising to their feet in what they probably imagined was an intimidating display of solidarity. 7-foot-tall crystals catching the light, refracting threats and promises of consequences that would follow any continued resistance to their obviously reasonable demands. Or what? Prismdar demanded. Your primitive weapons have been confiscated. Station security will ensure that any violence results in your immediate detention. What exactly do you imagine you can accomplish? Torres smiled, and for the first time since entering the conference room, it was completely genuine. Well, she said, I suppose we're about to find out. The elbow strike happened faster than Consortium nervous systems could process. One moment Prismdar was leaning across the table in a display of crystalline superiority, and the next moment he was discovering that human bone structure, when properly applied, was significantly harder than even the most sophisticated crystal matrix. The sound was remarkably similar to someone dropping a chandelier onto a marble floor, followed immediately by harmonic screaming as Prismdar discovered that crystalline pain receptors were every bit as sophisticated as the rest of their evolved physiology. His grip on Torres's wrist vanished as he stumbled backward, clutching what remained of his facial structure and producing sounds that would have been musical if they hadn't been quite so obviously agonized. The other Consortium members stood frozen in shock for approximately 1.3 seconds, which was exactly long enough for Torres to demonstrate why evolution on a Deathworld produced certain advantages that peaceful civilizations had apparently never considered. The first one managed to extend his crystalline appendages in what might have been an attack, or might have been an attempt at intimidation. Torres caught him with a backhand that sent him crashing into the conference room's expensive furniture, which turned out to be significantly less durable than advertised when subjected to the impact of a flying crystal formation. The second one made the mistake of trying to grab her from behind, apparently under the impression that surprise would compensate for the fact that he was attempting to wrestle with a member of a species that had evolved recreational combat. Torres introduced him to the concept of a shoulder throw, which resulted in another chandelier dropping sound as he discovered the tensile strength limitations of the conference room's floor. The third one, displaying the kind of tactical genius that had probably made him a natural choice for trade negotiations, decided that the appropriate response was to call for security. This was actually a reasonable plan, except for the part where he tried to do it while charging at Torres with his crystalline fists raised in what was probably meant to be a threatening gesture. She caught his charge, redirected his momentum, using principles of physics that the Consortium had apparently never applied to personal combat, and sent him through the conference room's impressive holographic display system. The resulting crash was accompanied by a light show that would have been quite spectacular under other circumstances. The remaining Consortium members seemed to suddenly realize that they were dealing with someone who had been shaped by millions of years of evolution specifically designed to produce survivors, and that perhaps grabbing said person might not have been the optimal negotiating strategy. The conference room's emergency systems finally activated, filling the air with alarms that sounded like mechanical panic attacks. Security doors sealed with the kind of authoritative hissing that suggested the station's automated systems had concluded that something had gone terribly wrong, and that the appropriate response was to contain it until someone more qualified could figure out what to do. Torres straightened her diplomatic uniform, which had somehow remained perfectly pressed despite the recent festivities, and looked around the conference room at the scattered debris that had previously been both expensive furniture and intimidating alien negotiators. "Well," she said to no one in particular, "I suppose that concludes today's session." Chief Inspector Vexhai arrived approximately 4 minutes later with a security team that had been equipped for everything except the possibility that a single unarmed human could reduce an entire diplomatic delegation to crystalline shrapnel and harmonic whimpering. They found Torres seated calmly at what remained of the conference table, completing her incident report with a kind of bureaucratic thoroughness that would have impressed even a Zephyrian administrator. "What," Vexhai demanded in tones that suggested his worldview had recently suffered catastrophic structural damage, "exactly happened here?" Torres looked up from her paperwork with the expression of someone who had been asked to explain something so obvious that the question itself was mildly insulting. "Negotiations concluded unsuccessfully," she replied. "The Consortium representatives became physically aggressive, and I defended myself using reasonable force." Vexhai's 4 eyes performed the kind of synchronized movement that indicated his brain was attempting to process information that fundamentally contradicted everything he thought he understood about the universe. "Reasonable force," he repeated, gesturing at the wreckage surrounding them. "You destroyed an entire conference room." "Actually," Torres corrected, consulting her notes, "Consortium leader Prismdar destroyed most of the furniture when I redirected his charge into the holographic display system. The conference table was damaged when Representative Shadhai impacted it during his uncontrolled descent from the ceiling. I merely provided the initial kinetic energy transfers." "But," Vexhai sputtered, "but you were disarmed. We confiscated your weapons." Torres tilted her head slightly, as if she were trying to understand how someone could be confused by something so elementary. "Inspector," she said with the patience of someone explaining basic mathematics to a child. You confiscated a knife. A Class 7 personal combat implement. Yes, Torres agreed. You took away a piece of sharpened metal approximately 6 inches long. She stood up from her chair and gestured at herself with both hands. You left me with 10 fingers, 2 elbows, 2 knees, a skull designed to ram through obstacles, and approximately 650 muscles developed through millions of years of evolution specifically optimized for violence. You took away the least dangerous thing I was carrying. The silence that followed this explanation was the kind that usually preceded either enlightenment or nervous breakdowns. In Vexai's case, it appeared to be both. But, he said weakly, but civilized beings don't. We don't use violence to resolve disputes. Torres finished. Yes, you mentioned that. It's a lovely philosophy. Unfortunately, it only works when everyone involved agrees to follow it. Around the conference room, medics were carefully collecting the various pieces of what had previously been the Consortium's negotiating team. The crystals were still producing harmonic sounds, but they were significantly less arrogant than they had been an hour earlier. This is unprecedented, Vexai muttered, apparently talking more to himself than to anyone else. We'll have to revise all the security protocols. How do you confiscate an entire human? You don't, Torres replied helpfully. But you could try asking nicely next time. The aftermath of what station records would eventually classify as the conference room incident rippled through Nexus 7's diplomatic community like a shockwave through crystalline structures. Within hours, every species representative on the station had received detailed briefings about human anatomy, evolutionary biology, and the apparent limitations of peaceful development when confronted with beings who had learned to treat survival as a competitive sport. The Zephyrian Security Council called an emergency session that lasted 14 hours and produced a revised threat assessment that classified human diplomatic representatives as mobile weapons platforms with diplomatic immunity. They also instituted new protocols that were both completely inadequate and hilariously paranoid, including requirements that humans be escorted by security teams trained in Deathworlder management techniques, and that all negotiations take place in specially reinforced chambers designed to contain kinetic diplomatic incidents. The Crystalline Consortium, meanwhile, spent several days in intensive care, while medical teams attempted to repair damage that their species had never evolved mechanisms to handle. When they finally recovered enough to resume communications, their first message was a formal request to renegotiate their original proposal, along with a detailed apology for any cultural misunderstandings that might have occurred during their previous interaction. Their new offer was significantly more generous. Torres spent the remainder of her stay on Nexus 7 fielding requests from other species representatives who had suddenly discovered urgent needs to establish trade relationships with humanity. It seemed that witnessing someone reduce a conference room to rubble using nothing but applied physics had caused a dramatic re-evaluation of human potential as business partners. It's fascinating, she observed to the Altarian ambassador during one such meeting, how quickly perspectives change when theoretical superiority meets practical demonstration. The ambassador, whose species had evolved in low gravity and possessed all the physical resilience of wet tissue paper, nodded eagerly while maintaining a respectful distance. Indeed, Commander Torres, we've always admired human efficiency. Perhaps we could discuss mining equipment purchases? Our current machinery seems rather inadequate compared to your people's natural capabilities. When Torres finally departed Nexus 7, Chief Inspector Vexai personally oversaw the return of her confiscated belongings. The ceremonial knife was presented to her with the kind of nervous reverence usually reserved for handling live explosives. Your weapon, Commander, he said, clearly hoping that she wouldn't decide to test its effectiveness immediately. Torres accepted the knife and clipped it to her belt with the casual ease of someone putting on a wristwatch. Thank you, Inspector. I do hope your new security protocols work out well for you. As her shuttle departed, Vexai stood in the observation deck watching the small craft disappear into the starfield beyond. Around him, other security personnel were implementing the new Deathworlder protocols with the kind of bureaucratic enthusiasm that suggested they still believed paperwork could solve problems that evolution had spent millions of years creating. Sir, One of his subordinates asked, "Do you really think the new containment procedures will be effective?" Vexai considered this question while reviewing the incident reports, the medical assessments, and the property damage claims that had resulted from one human defending herself with her elbows. "Probably not," he admitted finally. "But at least now we know what we're dealing with." The subordinate looked puzzled. "Which is?" Vexai glanced once more at the starfield where Torres's shuttle had vanished, carrying her back to a world where everything was designed to kill its inhabitants and somehow they had learned to call it home. "The terrifying realization that we've been worried about the wrong things," he said. "We spent so much time cataloging their weapons that we forgot to consider that humans don't need weapons. They are weapons." And somewhere in the depths of space, a simple folding knife rode peacefully in a diplomatic pouch, completely unnecessary, but somehow satisfied that its owner had once again proven that the most dangerous thing about humans wasn't what they carried in their hands. It was what they had learned to do with everything else.